Some moments change the course of multiple lives with a single decision. When six brothers stood abandoned on a frozen railway platform in the dead of winter, society had already written them off as lost causes. But a solitary figure emerging from the Montana wilderness saw something different. 6 reasons to defy every rule, risk everything he'd built in isolation, and prove that family isn't always born from blood. What happened next would challenge an entire town's understanding of duty, belonging, and what it truly means to leave no child behind. This is the story of how one impossible choice transformed 7 broken souls into something the frontier had never seen before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The January wind cut through Timber Ridge, Montana, like a serrated blade, carrying with it the bite of mountain ice and the promise of a brutal night ahead. It was 1892, and the Northern Pacific Railway Station stood as a lonely outpost where civilization met the unforgiving wilderness. The platform, constructed from rough-hewn timber that had already begun to weather gray, creaked under the assault of wind that howled down from the Bitterroot Range. Station Master Eugene Holloway stood behind his frost-covered window, watching the afternoon train pull away in a cloud of steam and coal smoke. He was a compact man of 53, with a face that had been hardened by 30 years of frontier service and eyes that had seen more human misery than most people could imagine. His job was simple: manage the station, process freight, sell tickets, and maintain order in this tiny intersection between the wild country and the settled world. What wasn't simple was the situation developing on his platform. 6 boys stood in a tight cluster near the far end, their threadbare coats offering pitiful protection against the savage cold. Holloway had watched them arrive 3 hours earlier on the eastbound train from Butte, accompanied by a harried-looking woman from the Children's Aid Society, who'd purchased their tickets, handed him a sealed envelope, and departed on the next train west without so much as a backward glance. The envelope contained a brief note explaining that the boys, brothers, apparently were being transported to an orphanage in Billings. They were to wait for the evening train, which would arrive at 6 o'clock. It was now approaching 4. The temperature was dropping fast, and Holloway had a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The oldest boy couldn't have been more than 14. He stood at the front of the group with his arms spread slightly, as if his thin frame could somehow shield his younger brothers from the wind. His face was gaunt, marked by the kind of premature aging that came from responsibility no child should have to carry. His eyes, a startling blue against his weather-darkened skin, swept constantly across the platform, the tracks, the station building, always watching, always assessing threats. Behind him, the other 5 boys huddled close. Holloway could see them clearly from his window. A boy of perhaps 12, with sandy hair that stuck out at odd angles. Twins who looked about 10, with identical freckled faces and scared expressions. A younger boy of maybe 7, who kept his hands thrust deep in his pockets. And the smallest couldn't be more than 5 years old, who clung to the oldest boy's leg like a burr on wool. They had one carpet bag between them, worn at the corners and tied shut with rope. That bag represented everything these boys owned in the world, and Holloway suspected it contained precious little. He'd seen orphan trains before. The Children's Aid Society had been shipping unwanted children west for decades now, presenting it as charitable work while eastern cities rid themselves of inconvenient problems. Some of the children found good homes with families who needed extra hands and were willing to provide care in exchange for labor. Others found situations that were little better than indentured servitude. And some, like these boys apparently, were simply being transferred from one institution to another, like freight that needed redirecting. Holloway checked his pocket watch. The evening train was still 2 hours away, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing. His station had a small waiting room with a pot-bellied stove. But he'd closed it for cleaning earlier and hadn't bothered to relight the fire since there hadn't been any passengers waiting. He should invite the boys inside. He knew that. It was the decent thing to do. But Eugene Holloway had learned over 3 decades on the frontier that decent things often led to complications. If he brought them in, he'd have to fill out paperwork explaining why. He'd have to take responsibility for them, even temporarily. And if something went wrong, if one of them got sick or ran away, or caused trouble, it would be his problem to solve. So he stayed behind his window, telling himself they looked hardy enough, that frontier children were tougher than city kids, that 2 hours in the cold wouldn't kill them. He was wrong about that last part, though he wouldn't realize it until later. The oldest boy, his name was Samuel Clayton, though Holloway didn't know that yet, pulled his brothers closer and tried to organize them into a tighter formation. The wind was coming from the northwest, so he positioned them against the station's outer wall, where the building itself provided some shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Tommy, Marcus, stop your shivering," he said to the twins, his voice carrying a forced confidence that didn't match his worried eyes. "We just got to wait a little longer, then we'll be on that train, and it'll be warm inside." "I'm not shivering," Tommy lied, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely get the words out. "Marcus is the one who's cold." "Am not," Marcus protested weakly, but his blue-tinged lips told a different story. The 12-year-old, whose name was Benjamin, moved closer to Samuel. "Sam, maybe we should ask the station man if we can wait inside, just until the train comes." Samuel glanced toward the station building, where he could see Holloway's silhouette behind the frosted window. "He knows we're out here, Ben. If he wanted us inside, he'd have said so. But the little ones, I know." Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked down at the smallest boy, 4-year-old Peter, who had his face pressed against Samuel's leg and was making small, whimpering sounds. "I know, but we can't beg. We got pride, even if we got nothing else." The 7-year-old, whose name was Daniel, spoke up in a voice that was trying hard to be brave. "Tell us again about the orphanage, Sam, about how it's going to be better than the last place." Samuel felt his heart sink. He didn't want to lie to his brothers, but he also couldn't tell them the truth, that he had no idea what waited for them in Billings, that every institution they'd been in so far had been worse than the last, that he was terrified of what would happen when they arrived at yet another place that didn't want them. Their parents had died 8 months ago in a mining accident in Butte. Their father, Thomas Clayton, had been working in the copper mines when a tunnel collapsed, killing him and 17 other men instantly. Their mother, Sarah, had lasted 3 weeks after receiving the news before consumption, poverty, and grief had taken her too. Samuel had tried to keep them together. He'd worked any job he could find, hauling coal, sweeping shops, running errands for merchants who paid in pennies. Benjamin had helped, lying about his age to get work in a laundry. But it hadn't been enough. 6 boys needed food, shelter, and clothing, and 2 children's wages couldn't provide it. The church had gotten involved, which had led to the Children's Aid Society, which had led to the first orphanage in Butte. That place had been a nightmare of overcrowding, inadequate food, and staff who viewed the children as burdens to be managed rather than souls to be nurtured. When Samuel had fought back against a supervisor who'd beaten Daniel for dropping a water bucket, they'd been labeled troublemakers and transferred to this new facility in Billings. "The orphanage," Samuel began, forcing his voice to stay steady, "is going to have warm beds and 3 meals a day. And maybe they'll let us stay together instead of splitting us up. You promise?" Peter asked, his voice muffled against Samuel's leg. Samuel couldn't make that promise. He'd heard too many stories about siblings being separated, sent to different farms or families, never seeing each other again. But looking down at Peter's trusting face, at the hope in his brother's eyes, he found himself saying, "I promise. I'll do everything I can to keep us together. That's the one promise I can make and keep." The wind picked up, and with it came the first flakes of snow. They were small at first, just a few scattered crystals that melted on contact with the warm platform planks. But within minutes, the snowfall intensified into a proper storm. the kind that turned the Montana wilderness into a white death trap. Inside the station, Holloway watched the snow with growing concern. The evening train would still come. Northern Pacific prided itself on maintaining schedules even in harsh weather, but those boys would be half frozen by the time it arrived. He should bring them in. He really should, but the paperwork, the complications, the potential for things to go wrong. Holloway turned away from the window and busied himself with sorting mail, telling himself the boys would be fine, that frontier children were resilient, that it wasn't his responsibility to mother every waif who passed through his station. On the platform, Samuel made a decision. "We need to move. There's got to be somewhere better than this." "Where?" Benjamin asked, looking around at the empty platform. The locked station building, the wilderness beyond. Samuel's eyes fixed on a structure about 50 yards from the main platform, a freight shed where shipments waited for collection. It was a simple building, essentially just a roof and 3 walls, but it would provide more shelter than their current position. "There," he said, pointing. "Come on, stay close." They moved as a unit, Samuel leading with Peter in his arms, the others following in a tight line. The snow was falling harder now, and the 50 yards felt like 50 miles. By the time they reached the freight shed, they were all covered in white, their breath coming in gasping clouds. The shed wasn't much, but it was better. Stacks of crates and barrels provided windbreaks, and the roof kept the worst of the snow off them. Samuel set Peter down and began organizing their space, stacking crates to create a more enclosed area where they could huddle together. "Everybody in close," he ordered. "Body heat is all we got, so we share it." They pressed together in a tight knot, the older boys on the outside, the younger ones protected in the middle. It helped, but not enough. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. "Sam," Daniel said quietly, "I can't feel my feet anymore." "Wiggle your toes," Samuel instructed, trying to keep panic out of his voice. "Keep moving them. Don't let them go numb." But he could see that they were all in trouble. Tommy's lips were turning blue. Marcus had stopped shivering, which Samuel knew was worse than shivering. Benjamin's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid, and Peter had gone still and quiet in a way that terrified Samuel more than crying would have. They were dying. Slowly, quietly, on a freight platform in Montana, while a warm station building stood just yards away with a man inside who'd decided they weren't his problem. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to think. He could try the station door again, could beg if he had to, could abandon his pride if it meant saving his brothers. But something told him it wouldn't matter. He'd seen that look in adults' eyes too many times, the look that said children like them were inconvenient, disposable, not worth the trouble. They were going to die out here, and nobody would care enough to even feel guilty about it. He was wrong about that too. The man who emerged from the tree line beyond the platform moved like a force of nature, given human form. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of years carrying heavy packs through impossible terrain. His face was weathered dark by sun and wind, obscured partially by a thick beard that had never seen a barber's scissors. He wore buckskin clothing that had been expertly crafted and maintained, and he moved through the snow with the confident stride of someone for whom wilderness was home rather than hazard. His name was Jacob Brennan, though most people in Timber Ridge simply called him the Mountain Man when they spoke of him at all, which wasn't often. He was 41 years old and had spent the last 15 years living alone in a cabin deep in the Bitterroot Range, emerging only occasionally to trade furs and purchase supplies. He'd been on his way to do exactly that, his pack-horse laden with pelts that would fetch good prices, when he'd spotted the boys on the platform. Something about the sight had stopped him cold. 6 children, huddled against a storm, while a warm building stood right there with its doors closed against them. Jacob Brennan had spent 15 years avoiding humanity, convincing himself that solitude was preferable to the disappointments and betrayals that came with human connection. But watching those boys slowly freeze to death was more than even his hardened heart could tolerate. He approached the freight shed without announcement, his footsteps silent despite his size. Samuel saw him first and immediately pushed his brothers behind him. His thin arms spread in a protective gesture that was simultaneously brave and pathetic. "Stay back," Samuel warned, his voice stronger than his shaking body. "We're not bothering nobody. Just waiting for our train." Jacob stopped, recognizing fear when he saw it. These boys had learned not to trust adults, which meant adults had given them good reasons for that distrust. "You're freezing to death," Jacob said simply. His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. "That train's not coming for another hour at least, maybe more with this storm. You'll be dead before it arrives." "We're fine," Samuel insisted. But his chattering teeth undermined the claim. Jacob studied the scene. 6 boys, one carpetbag, inadequate clothing, and exposure that had already progressed to dangerous levels. He could see hypothermia in their movements, in their decreased shivering, in the smallest one's ominous stillness. "You're not fine. You're dying. And I'm not going to stand here and watch it happen." He moved closer and Samuel tensed. "I've got a camp about 3 miles into the hills. There's a fire, food, and shelter. You come with me, warm up, and I'll bring you back before that train arrives. Or you can stay here and freeze. Your choice." It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. But Jacob understood that the boy needed to feel like he had some control, some agency in a situation where he'd had none for too long. Samuel looked at his brothers, at their blue lips, their glazed eyes, at little Peter, who wasn't even crying anymore. Then he looked back at the mountain man, at this stranger who could be anyone, could want anything, but death was certain if they stayed. This man was only a possibility of danger. "If you hurt any of them," Samuel said, his voice breaking, "I'll kill you. I don't care how big you are. I'll find a way." Jacob nodded slowly, recognizing the statement not as a threat, but as a promise, as a desperate declaration of the only power this boy had left. "Fair enough," he said. "Now let's get moving before we lose the light." He moved forward and scooped up Peter without asking permission, wrapping the tiny boy in the fur-lined coat he wore over his buckskins. The others he helped to their feet, checking each one briefly with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd treated exposure before. "The little ones can't walk 3 miles in this," he told Samuel. "I'll carry 2. You and the older boy take 1 each. The middle ones walk between us. We move steady, no stopping." "Understood." Samuel wanted to argue, to maintain some semblance of control, but he was too cold and too scared to waste energy on pride. He nodded. "Good. Let's go." As they prepared to leave, Jacob glanced back at the station building where Eugene Holloway's silhouette was visible behind the frosted window. Their eyes met for just a moment, and something passed between them. Judgment, condemnation, a silent indictment of the choice Holloway had made. Then Jacob turned away, leading 6 freezing boys into the wilderness, while the station master stood safe and warm behind his glass, watching them disappear into the snow. Neither man could have predicted that this moment, this single decision, would set in motion events that would transform not just 7 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to be family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trek through the wilderness tested every ounce of strength the boys had left. Jacob moved with purposeful efficiency, breaking trail through snow that was already ankle-deep and rising. He carried Peter against his chest, the small boy's face barely visible beneath the fur coat, while Daniel rode on his broad shoulders, clinging with numb fingers to Jacob's thick hair. Samuel struggled behind with Tommy in his arms, the 10-year-old twin heavier than he looked. Benjamin carried Marcus, though both were staggering with exhaustion. The pace Jacob set was relentless but necessary. Stop too long in this storm, and they'd never start again. How much further? Benjamin gasped after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 40 minutes. "Another mile," Jacob called back without slowing. "Keep moving. Talk to each other." "Stay awake." Samuel tried to comply, but his mind was growing foggy. The cold had moved past painful into something almost comfortable, which some distant part of his brain recognized as dangerous. His arms burned from carrying Tommy, and his legs felt like lead weights, but he forced himself to keep placing one foot in front of the other. The forest around them was transformed by snow into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Massive ponderosa pines stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with white. The wind had diminished somewhat among the trees, but the temperature continued its brutal descent. Jacob navigated through the wilderness with absolute certainty, never hesitating at intersections or unclear trails. This was his domain, learned and memorized through 15 years of solitary ranging. He knew every ridge, every valley, every game trail and water source within 50 square miles. When they finally broke through into a clearing, Samuel nearly wept with relief. The cabin stood against the base of a rocky outcropping, built from massive logs that had been expertly notched and fitted. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, promising warmth that seemed almost mythical after the brutal cold. "Almost there," Jacob said, his voice the first encouragement he'd offered during the entire journey. "Just a few more yards." The cabin door opened to reveal an interior that was Spartan but well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling cheerfully behind an iron grate. The space was perhaps 20 feet square, with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, rough-hewn furniture that showed skilled craftsmanship, and supplies stacked with military precision along the walls. Animal pelts covered the floor and hung on the walls for insulation. Cooking implements hung from iron hooks near the fireplace. Shelves held books, tools, and various supplies. Everything had its place, maintained with the meticulous care of someone who lived alone and depended entirely on his own organization. Jacob set the boys down near the fireplace with quick efficiency. "Don't get too close to the fire yet. Warm up gradually, or you'll damage tissue." He moved to a chest against the far wall and pulled out wool blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. "Strip off anything wet. Wrap in these." The boys hesitated, their ingrained modesty warring with desperate need for warmth. Jacob turned his back, busying himself at the fireplace where a pot of stew had been simmering. "I'm not looking. Get those wet clothes off before you lose fingers and toes to frostbite." Samuel made the decision for them. "Do what he says." He helped Peter out of his soaked clothes, wrapped him in a blanket, then saw to the others before changing himself. The wool was rough but blessedly warm, and within minutes all 6 boys were huddled near the fire in various stages of recovery. Jacob ladled stew into wooden bowls, more bowls than one man living alone should reasonably own, Samuel noticed, and distributed them wordlessly. The stew was thick with venison, potatoes, and wild onions, seasoned with herbs Samuel couldn't identify. It was the best thing he'd tasted in months. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire, the wind outside, and the quiet slurping of boys who'd been too cold and scared to remember hunger until food appeared before them. Jacob watched them with an unreadable expression, occasionally adding wood to the fire or refilling empty bowls without being asked. Peter fell asleep halfway through his second bowl, curling against Samuel like a cat seeking warmth. The twins weren't far behind, their eyes drooping as warmth and food worked their magic. Even Benjamin and Daniel struggled to stay conscious. "Let them sleep," Jacob said, seeing Samuel try to keep his brothers awake. "They need rest more than anything else right now." "What about the train?" Samuel asked, though his own eyes felt heavy as stones. "We're supposed to be on the 6 o'clock to Billings. Train's probably delayed by the storm anyway. And even if it's not, those boys aren't fit to travel tonight. They need 12 hours minimum to recover from that exposure." Samuel wanted to argue, but exhaustion and the first real safety he'd felt in months were overwhelming. "The orphanage. They're expecting us." "They can keep expecting. Those boys nearly died tonight because some station master couldn't be bothered to open a door. I'm not sending them back out into that storm. There was finality in Jacob's tone that discouraged argument. Samuel studied the mountain man, trying to understand this stranger who'd emerged from nowhere to save them. Jacob Brennan was a hard man to read. His weathered face showed little emotion, his movements were economical and purposeful, and he spoke only when necessary. But his actions told a different story than his gruff exterior suggested. "Why did you help us?" Samuel asked quietly, not wanting to wake his sleeping brothers. Jacob was silent for so long that Samuel thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low and roughened by something that might have been old pain. 15 years ago, I had a family, a wife and a daughter. They died when our house caught fire while I was away trapping. I came home to ashes and graves my neighbors had already dug. He stared into the fire, his face carved from shadow and flickering light. I blamed myself, blamed God, blamed everyone and everything, came up here to get away from people, from memories, from the guilt of surviving when they didn't. Told myself I was better off alone, that caring about people just led to pain. Samuel remained quiet, sensing that interrupting would stop the flow of words. Then today I saw 6 boys freezing to death, while a man with the power to help them chose not to. Saw that station master make the same choice I've been making for 15 years. The choice to look away, to not get involved, to protect himself from the messiness of caring. Jacob's jaw tightened, and I realized that's not survival, that's just a different kind of death. He turned to look at Samuel directly. So I helped you because I'm tired of being dead, because maybe saving 6 boys won't bring back my daughter, but it might prove that her father wasn't always the coward he became after she died. The raw honesty of it left Samuel speechless. This wasn't a saint or a hero. This was a broken man trying to stitch himself back together through an act of basic decency. "What was her name?" Samuel asked. "Your daughter." "Emma. She was 6 years old. Had red hair like her mother and a laugh that sounded like creek water over stones." Jacob's voice caught slightly. "She'd be about your age now if she'd lived." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the kind that forms between people who've shared something true. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 6 boys slept the sleep of the truly exhausted, safe for the first time in longer than any of them could remember. As the fire burned low, Jacob moved quietly around the cabin, checking on each boy with a gentleness that contradicted his rough appearance. He adjusted blankets, felt foreheads for fever, examined fingers and toes for frostbite damage. Samuel watched through half-closed eyes, seeing in these small actions the ghost of a father who'd once cared for his own child with the same tender attention. "They'll be all right," Jacob said, noticing Samuel was still awake. "No permanent damage. They're tougher than they look." "We've had to be," Samuel replied. "After our parents died, nobody wanted 6 boys. Too many mouths to feed, too much trouble. The orphanages take us because that's what they're supposed to do, but nobody actually wants us there either." Jacob added another log to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "What happened to your parents?" Samuel told him about the mine collapse, about his mother's death, about the desperate months trying to keep them together, about the succession of institutions that had failed them. Jacob listened without interrupting, his face impassive, but his eyes revealing a deep well of understanding. "The orphanage in Billings," Samuel finished, "is supposed to be better. That's what they always say. But I don't believe it anymore. I think we're just being moved around until we're old enough to be put to work or thrown out completely." "Probably right about that," Jacob said with brutal honesty. "The world isn't kind to children without parents or money. Never has been." "So what do we do?" Jacob looked at him steadily. "What do you want to do?" It was the first time in 8 months that anyone had asked Samuel what he wanted. The question hit him with unexpected force. "I want to keep my brothers together. I want us to have a home, not just a place we're tolerated until we become inconvenient. I want them to have childhoods instead of just survival." his voice broke, "but I don't know how to give them that." "Those are good wants," Jacob said quietly. "Worth fighting for. But impossible. Maybe, maybe not." Jacob stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow that continued to fall in thick curtains. "That storm's not letting up. You boys won't be going anywhere tomorrow either. Gives us time to think about options." Options? Samuel's heart began to beat faster. What kind of options? Jacob turned back from the window, his expression difficult to read in the firelight. "I'm not sure yet, but I've spent 15 years running from responsibility, telling myself I was better off alone. Maybe it's time I stopped running and started figuring out what it means to be part of something again." Samuel didn't dare hope, didn't want to misunderstand and face another disappointment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying get some sleep. We'll talk more when your brothers are awake and can be part of the conversation. This involves all of you, so all of you get a say. It wasn't a promise, but it was something, a possibility where before there had been only bleak certainty." Samuel lay down among his sleeping brothers, pulling the wool blanket tight around himself, and for the first time in months allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just endless grey, institutional walls and the constant fear of separation. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana wilderness. Inside, 7 people who'd been strangers that morning slept under the same roof, bound together by circumstance and the fragile beginning of something that might eventually become trust. Jacob sat by the fire long after Samuel fell asleep, staring into flames that reminded him of the fire that had taken his family. He'd thought that pain would never heal, that the best he could do was avoid creating new wounds by avoiding new connections. But watching these 6 boys sleep, seeing the trust Peter showed by curling against Samuel, the way the twins instinctively held hands even in sleep, the protective way Benjamin had positioned himself between the younger boys and the door, something long dormant in Jacob's chest began to stir. He'd saved their lives tonight. That was fact, but the question that kept him awake was what came next. He could return them to the platform tomorrow or the next day, send them on to Billings, and whatever fate awaited them there. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing, the choice that required nothing more from him than a few days of hospitality, or he could do something else, something that terrified him more than any wilderness danger he'd ever faced. He could try to become the kind of man his daughter had believed him to be before the fire taught him that belief and reality were often cruelly different things. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Jacob Brennan sat alone with a decision that would define the rest of his life and the lives of 6 boys who'd been abandoned on a platform to freeze. By morning, he would have to choose. Dawn broke over the Bitterroot Range with the peculiar clarity that follows heavy snowfall. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Inside the cabin, morning light filtered through the single window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Samuel woke first, disoriented by warmth and the unfamiliar sensation of having slept without fear. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then memory returned in a rush. The platform, the freezing cold, the mountain man who'd appeared like something from a fever dream. He sat up carefully, not wanting to disturb his brothers, who were still sprawled in various positions around the fireplace. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the cabin retained enough heat to keep the morning chill at bay. Someone had added blankets to their sleeping forms during the night, tucking them in with a care that made Samuel's throat tighten. Jacob Brennan stood at the window, silhouetted against the morning light. He'd been awake for hours, judging by the fresh coffee brewing on the iron hook over the rebuilt fire and the snow he'd already cleared from the cabin's entrance. He turned when he heard Samuel stir. "Morning," Jacob said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "Coffee's ready if you drink it. Otherwise there's water from the spring. Still cold but clean. Coffee's fine," Samuel replied, moving carefully to avoid waking the others. He accepted the tin cup Jacob handed him, the bitter liquid nothing like the coffee he'd had before, but warming nonetheless. "Thank you." "For everything." Jacob nodded curtly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Your brothers will sleep another hour at least. They need it. In the meantime, we should talk." Samuel's stomach knotted with familiar anxiety. Here it came. The conditions, the expectations, the revelation of what this rescue would cost them. Nothing in his experience had taught him that kindness came without a price. "I've been thinking about your situation," Jacob began, settling into a chair he'd carved from a single massive piece of wood. "About what you said last night. Wanting to keep your brothers together, wanting them to have more than just survival." "I know it's not possible," Samuel said quickly, trying to preempt disappointment. "I know we'll have to go to Billings. I needed to say it out loud once, even if nothing can change. What if something could change?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Samuel was afraid to examine. "What do you mean?" Jacob leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "I've lived alone for 15 years, told myself that's how it had to be, that I couldn't trust myself with anything that mattered after I failed to protect my family. But last night, watching you boys sleep, I realized something." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "Isolation isn't healing. It's just running. And I'm tired of running from the parts of myself that used to be worth something." Samuel's heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. "I still don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying this cabin could hold 7 people instead of 1. I'm saying these mountains could teach 6 boys everything they need to survive and more. I'm saying maybe we could make an arrangement that serves everyone's needs." The hope that surged through Samuel was immediately crushed by learned caution. "The law won't allow it. We're wards of the Children's Aid Society. They have legal custody. You can't just keep us." "No, I can't. But I might be able to acquire custody through proper channels." Jacob stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a folder of papers that looked official and important. "I'm not some vagrant living outside the law. I own this land, bought and paid for with a proper deed. I have income from fur trading that's documented and taxable. I'm a citizen in good standing with no criminal record." He spread the papers on the rough wooden table. "More importantly, I was a teacher before I came to these mountains. Taught mathematics and natural sciences at a school in Virginia City for 8 years. Lost my position after my family died because I couldn't function anymore, but the credentials are still valid." Samuel stared at the documents, his mind racing. "You're saying you could take legal custody? Actually adopt us?" "Adoption might be complicated. 6 children at once raises questions. But guardianship? That's more feasible, especially if I can demonstrate I have the means to provide for you and the ability to ensure you receive proper education." Jacob's expression was serious, almost stern. "But before we discuss logistics, we need to talk about what this would actually mean." "I don't care what it means," Samuel said quickly. "Whatever you need from us, whatever work—" "Stop!" Jacob's voice was sharp enough to cut through Samuel's desperate tumble of words. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to avoid. I'm not looking for unpaid labor. I'm not looking for children to exploit or use. If we do this, it's because all 7 of us agree it's what we want, and everyone enters into it with clear eyes about what's expected." He moved back to his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Here's what I can offer. A home in these mountains. Food, shelter, safety, and education. Both the book learning that schools provide and the practical knowledge needed to thrive in wilderness. You'd work, yes, because everyone who lives here contributes. But you'd work as family members, not servants. You'd learn skills that could serve you whether you stay in Montana or go elsewhere as adults. And what do you get?" Samuel asked, still waiting for the catch, for the reveal of the true price. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly? A reason to be more than just a man waiting to die. A chance to prove that life can have meaning again after you think you've lost everything that mattered." Maybe even a chance to honor my daughter's memory by being the kind of father she deserved, not to you, not as a replacement, but as someone who takes seriously the responsibility of caring for children who need it. He met Samuel's eyes directly. But I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't charity. This is a partnership. You boys have agency here. If we proceed, you get a say in how this household runs. And if it doesn't work, if you're miserable or I'm failing you or we discover we can't live together, we revisit the arrangement. I won't force you to stay in a situation that's not serving you, and you can't expect me to tolerate behavior that makes this place unlivable. Samuel's coffee had gone cold in his hands, forgotten in the weight of this conversation. Why would you do this? You don't know us. We could be terrible kids. We could steal from you or destroy your things, or you could, Jacob agreed. But somehow I doubt it. I watched you last night, Samuel. Watched you organize your brothers to survive. Watched you carry a boy your own size through a blizzard, even though you were half frozen yourself. Watched you maintain dignity and courage in circumstances that would break most adults. He paused. Those aren't the actions of a terrible kid. Those are the actions of someone who understands responsibility and sacrifice. Behind them, movement signaled that the other boys were beginning to wake. Peter's small voice, still thick with sleep, cut through the heavy atmosphere. "Sam, where are we?" Samuel turned to his youngest brother, then looked back at Jacob. "Can I talk to them? Explain what you're suggesting?" "They deserve to be part of this decision." "Absolutely." "Take your time. I'll make breakfast." As Jacob busied himself at the fireplace, preparing what turned out to be an impressive amount of food, considering the remote location, Samuel gathered his brothers. They clustered around him with various levels of wakefulness, ranging from Peter's confused drowsiness to Benjamin's sharp alertness. "The mountain man, Mr. Brennan, he's offering us something," Samuel began, then stopped, unsure how to explain something he himself barely dared to believe. "He's offering us a home. Here in this cabin in these mountains. Legal guardianship instead of the orphanage." The twins exchanged glances. Daniel's eyes went wide. Benjamin's expression turned skeptical. Peter just pressed closer to Samuel, not fully comprehending, but responding to his brother's tone. "What's the catch?" Benjamin asked, voicing the question they'd all learned to ask. "He says there isn't one. He says we'd live here as a family, work together, learn together. He used to be a teacher so he could handle our schooling. And he knows these mountains better than anyone. But why?" Tommy asked, expressing the bewilderment they all felt. "Why would he want 6 kids he doesn't know?" Samuel glanced at Jacob, who was pointedly focused on cooking, but certainly listening to every word. "Because he lost his own family and he's been alone too long. Because he saw us freezing and couldn't walk away. Because maybe he needs us as much as we need him." Marcus, usually the quieter of the twins, spoke up. "Is he mean? Will he hit us like they did at the Butte orphanage?" It was a fair question. The boys all carried marks, some visible, some not, from institutions that viewed discipline as synonymous with punishment. Jacob turned from the fireplace, spatula in hand, his expression grave. "I won't lie to you, boys. If we do this, there will be rules. There will be consequences when rules are broken. This life requires discipline because mistakes in the wilderness can be fatal." He paused, making sure he had their attention. "But punishment and teaching aren't the same thing. I don't believe in hitting children. I believe in explaining why something matters and helping you understand consequences. Will I be firm? Yes. Will I expect effort and honesty? Absolutely. Will I raise a hand to you in anger? Never." Peter tugged on Samuel's sleeve. "Will we have to split up? Will we all be together?" "That's the whole point," Jacob said, his voice gentling for the smallest boy. "You stay together. All 6 of you, as brothers should. This cabin's not huge, but it's got space. We'd add on to it come spring. Build a proper bunkhouse for you boys. Give everyone room to breathe, but keep everyone close enough to remain a unit." Daniel, who'd been quiet throughout, finally spoke. "What if we don't like it? What if we want to leave?" "Then we figure out what's next," Jacob answered simply. "I'm not a prison warden. If this arrangement doesn't serve you, we revisit it. The goal is for everyone to thrive, not just survive. If that's not happening, we make changes. Samuel looked at each of his brothers in turn, reading their expressions, weighing their unspoken thoughts. He saw hope warring with fear, desperation fighting against learned caution. These boys had been disappointed so many times that trust felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. But the alternative was Billings. Another orphanage, possible separation, certain misery. "Can we have a few minutes?" Samuel asked Jacob. "To talk amongst ourselves?" "Of course. I'll be outside checking the horses and clearing more snow." "Take whatever time you need." After Jacob left, closing the door quietly behind him, the 6 brothers huddled together in a way that had become instinctive over months of having only each other to rely on. "I know this sounds too good to be true," Samuel began. "I know we've learned not to trust promises, but I believe him. I don't know why exactly, but I do." "He saved our lives," Benjamin said quietly. "He didn't have to. He could have walked past that platform like everyone else did. But he didn't. He gave us his food and his blankets," Tommy added. "And he stayed up all night keeping the fire going. I woke up once and saw him checking on all of us. He talks to us like we're people," Marcus said. "Not like we're problems or burdens." "That's different from everywhere else we've been," Daniel nodded slowly. "And he said we could leave if it doesn't work. Nobody's ever said that before. Everyone else acts like once we're there, we're stuck." They all looked at Peter, whose opinion mattered despite, or perhaps because of, his young age. The smallest Clayton brother thought carefully, his face scrunched in concentration. "I like him," Peter announced finally. "He's big and scary looking, but his voice is nice when he talks to me. And he smells like the forest, which is better than how the orphanage smelled." Despite the gravity of the decision, Samuel almost smiled. "Trust a 4-year-old to base judgment on smell, so we're agreed." Samuel looked at each brother. "We tell him yes." 5 heads nodded in unison. Samuel stood and walked to the door, opening it to find Jacob exactly where he'd said he'd be, checking over 2 horses that were sheltered in a lean-to beside the cabin, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. "Mr. Brennan?" Jacob turned, his expression carefully neutral, betraying none of the anxiety he must have felt waiting for their answer. "We talked, and we'd like to stay. If the offer's still open, if you really meant it." Something shifted in Jacob's weathered face, not quite a smile, but a softening that suggested the beginning of one. "I meant it. Every word." "Then yes, we accept. All 6 of us." Jacob walked back to the cabin, stopping in front of Samuel. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Samuel shook it. The mountain man's grip was firm but not crushing, calloused but careful. "Then we have work ahead of us," Jacob said. "Legal work, practical work, and the harder work of learning to be a family. It won't be easy. There'll be days we frustrate each other, days we question this decision. But if we commit to honesty, to effort, and to giving each other grace when we fail, and we will fail sometimes, then I believe we can build something that serves all of us." He looked past Samuel to where the other boys had gathered in the doorway, watching with expressions that blended hope and terror in equal measure. "So here's what happens next. We eat breakfast. Then we head to Timber Ridge to speak with the authorities, make this arrangement legal and proper. It'll take time, maybe weeks, to navigate the bureaucracy. You boys might have to spend some of that time in temporary situations while paperwork processes. But I give you my word, I will fight for every signature, every approval, every legal requirement until you're officially under my guardianship." "And then?" Benjamin asked. "And then we come back here and start building a life together." It was a beginning, tentative, uncertain, built on nothing more substantial than a desperate boy's trust and a lonely man's hope for redemption. But as the 7 of them sat down to breakfast in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the faint promise of possibility, it was enough. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent to human drama. But inside, something new was taking root, something fragile and precious and worth fighting for. The journey ahead would test them in ways none could anticipate. But for now, in this moment, they had warmth, food, and the beginning of something that might eventually become home. The ride into Timber Ridge took most of the morning. Jacob had fashioned a travois behind one of the horses, creating a makeshift sled where the younger boys could ride bundled in furs while the older ones took turns on horseback. The snow had transformed the landscape into something pristine and otherworldly, but beneath the beauty lurked constant danger that Jacob navigated with practiced ease. Samuel watched the mountain man as they traveled, noting the way Jacob constantly scanned the terrain, reading signs in the snow that Samuel couldn't begin to interpret. Occasionally, Jacob would point out tracks, elk, mountain lion, wolf, and explain what the animals had been doing, where they were likely headed, how recently they'd passed. It was the kind of knowledge that couldn't be learned from books, earned instead through years of intimate communion with wilderness. See how the snow's disturbed there? Jacob indicated a section where the pristine white had been churned into chaos. Deer bedded down during the storm, packed the snow with their body heat, then scattered when something spooked them. Probably a predator, but whatever it was moved on. No blood, so no kill. Benjamin, riding behind Jacob, leaned forward with interest. How can you tell they were spooked and didn't just leave normally? Pattern of the tracks. When deer browse and move naturally, their gait is relaxed. Tracks are evenly spaced. When they run, especially in deep snow, they bound, all four legs bunched together, then explode forward. See those crater-like impressions? That's fear, not casual movement. It was a casual exchange, teacher to student, but it represented something revolutionary for boys who'd spent months being spoken to rather than with. Jacob didn't simplify or condescend. He explained with the assumption that they were capable of understanding, and that assumption alone made them want to prove him right. As they descended from the higher elevations, civilization began to reassert itself. First came the logging. Roads, then scattered homesteads with smoke rising from chimneys, and finally the outskirts of Timber Ridge itself. The town was larger than Samuel had expected, a proper settlement rather than a mere outpost, with the main street boasting perhaps 20 established businesses, several churches, a schoolhouse, and enough residential development to suggest permanence rather than the transient nature of mining camps. The Northern Pacific Railway station stood at the south end, the same platform where they'd nearly frozen now, bustling with morning activity. Jacob guided them directly to the town's administrative center, a two-story building that housed both the sheriff's office and the territorial clerk. He dismounted with fluid grace despite his size and helped the younger boys down from the travois, checking each one with a gentle efficiency that was becoming familiar. "Stay close," he instructed. "Let me do the talking, unless they ask you direct questions. Be honest, but don't volunteer information beyond what's asked. Understood?" 6 heads nodded in unison. The interior of the building was warmed by a pot-bellied stove that radiated heat into the main room. Behind a desk sat a man in his 60s, with steel-grey hair and a face that suggested he'd seen everything the frontier could offer and hadn't been particularly impressed. A brass nameplate identified him as Sheriff Thomas Garrett. Garrett looked up from the paperwork he'd been reviewing, his expression shifting from bureaucratic neutrality to recognition when he saw Jacob. "Brennan, wasn't expecting to see you in town for another month at least. Usually you come down closer to spring thaw." His eyes moved to the 6 boys clustered behind the mountain man. "And you've brought company. That's new." "Sheriff." Jacob's tone was respectful, but not deferential. "I need to speak with you and whoever handles child welfare matters in this territory. It's a legal situation that requires proper navigation." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. "This about those orphan boys who went missing from the station yesterday? Holloway filed a report claiming 6 children vanished during the storm. Half. The town thought they'd frozen to death somewhere in the hills. They nearly did freeze to death, but it wasn't in the hills. It was on Holloway's platform while he watched from his warm office and did nothing." The sheriff's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious truth. I was there. I saw them huddled in a freight shed, already showing advanced hypothermia symptoms, while Holloway stood behind his window and chose not to open his door. If I hadn't intervened, you'd be dealing with 6 dead children this morning instead of a custody discussion. Garrett stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked around the desk and crouched down to Peter's level, his stern face softening slightly. "Son, is that true? Were you boys left out in the cold?" Peter looked to Samuel for permission. Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir," Peter said quietly. "We were very cold, and the man in the station didn't let us come inside. But Mr. Brennan found us and took us to his cabin and made us warm again." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He stood and called toward a back room. "Marshal, get Holloway in here. Now!" A younger man emerged, deputy's badge gleaming on his vest, and departed quickly to fulfill the order. Garrett turned back to Jacob. "You said this is about custody?" "I'm petitioning for legal guardianship of all 6 boys. Their parents are dead. They're currently wards of the Children's Aid Society being transferred between institutions, and I'm offering them a stable home with proper care and education." "You?" Garrett's tone was flat with disbelief. "Jacob Brennan, who hasn't spoken 10 words to another human being in the past decade, who lives alone in the mountains like some kind of hermit, wants to take guardianship of 6 children. I know how it sounds, do you? Because it sounds insane. You've got no experience with children, no wife to help manage them, and you're proposing to raise them in isolation miles from proper medical care, schooling, or social interaction. "I was a teacher for 8 years, Jacob replied, his voice remaining level despite the challenge. "I have documented income from legitimate trade. I own my land outright with a clear deed, and I can provide these boys with education, practical skills, and, most importantly, the chance to remain together as a family unit instead of being separated and shipped to various institutions." Samuel found his voice despite Jacob's earlier instruction. "Sir, if I may—" "You may not," Jacob said quietly but firmly. "Not yet." Garrett studied them all with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. "Even if everything you're saying is true, Brennan, the bureaucracy involved in this is substantial. The Children's Aid Society has legal custody. They'd need to approve the transfer. The territorial judge would have to review your petition. References would need to be checked, your circumstances verified. I'm prepared for all of that. I'm not asking for shortcuts or special treatment. I'm asking to start the proper legal process." The door opened, admitting Eugene Holloway flanked by the deputy. The station master's face went pale when he saw Jacob and the 6 boys. "Sheriff, what's this about? I've got trains to—" "You've got explaining to do," Garrett interrupted. "These boys claim you left them to freeze on your platform during yesterday's storm. They claim you watched them from your warm office and refused them shelter." Holloway's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, defensive indignation. "Now wait just a minute. Those boys showed up without proper supervision, without advance notice. I had responsibilities, procedures to follow. The procedure for children freezing to death is to let them inside," Jacob said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut. "You had a warm room, a stove, and the basic human decency most animals possess. But you chose your paperwork over their lives. I chose to maintain proper order. You don't understand the complications, the liability issues. I understand that 6 children nearly died because you valued convenience over compassion." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman in her 40s, dressed in practical wool with a severe hairstyle that somehow softened rather than hardened her features. She carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Sheriff Garrett, your deputy said there was an emergency involving children." Her eyes swept the room, landing on the boys with an expression that mixed concern with practiced assessment. "These must be the orphans Holloway reported missing. Mrs. Adelaide Preston," Garrett made the introduction. "She handles child welfare cases for the Territorial Social Services. Mrs. Preston, this is Jacob Brennan. He's the one who found the boys and apparently saved their lives. Now he's petitioning for guardianship." Adelaide's eyebrows rose, but unlike the sheriff, her surprise seemed tempered with interest rather than skepticism. She approached the boys directly, her manner businesslike but not unkind. "I'm Mrs. Preston. My job is to ensure children in difficult circumstances are properly cared for. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers. Will you give me that?" Samuel stepped slightly forward, positioning himself as spokesman. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. First, what happened yesterday?" "Start from when you arrived at the station." Samuel recounted the events, the long wait on the platform, the dropping temperature, Holloway's refusal to admit them, their retreat to the freight shed, Jacob's intervention, and the night in the cabin. He spoke clearly and factually, neither embellishing nor minimizing. The other boys occasionally added details, their accounts corroborating each other in ways that suggested truth rather than rehearsed story. Adelaide listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing. When Samuel finished, she turned to Holloway. "You left 6 children, the youngest barely past toddler age, outside during a blizzard while you remained inside a heated building." "I had protocols," Holloway began. "Protocol doesn't supersede basic human decency. Mr. Holloway, we'll be addressing this separately. But right now my concern is these children's welfare going forward." She turned back to Jacob. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate that you intervened when no one else did. That speaks well of your character. But guardianship of 6 children is a massive undertaking, especially for someone living in isolation. Walk me through your reasoning." Jacob met her gaze steadily. "I lost my own family 15 years ago. My wife and daughter died in a fire while I was away. I retreated to the mountains because I couldn't face the world that had taken them from me. But isolation isn't healing, Mrs. Preston. It's just slow dying." His voice remained even, but something in it suggested depths of pain carefully controlled. "Yesterday, when I saw those boys being left to freeze, I saw myself. I saw someone making the choice to look away, to protect themselves from the messiness of caring. And I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep being the man who walks past suffering because it's easier than engaging with it." He gestured to the boys. "These children need stability, education, and the chance to remain together. I can provide all 3. I have teaching credentials, legitimate income, and land. What I lacked was purpose. They need someone who'll fight for them. I need something worth fighting for. That's not charity or heroism. That's mutual necessity forming something that might become genuine care." Adelaide studied him for a long moment. "Pretty words, Mr. Brennan, but children need more than philosophy. They need daily care, medical attention when sick, social development, preparation for eventual independence. Can you provide those things miles from town, in a cabin built for one person?" "With modification and effort, yes. The cabin can be expanded. I come to town regularly for supplies and trade. That schedule can accommodate medical needs and social interaction. As for preparation for independence, I'd argue that learning to be self-sufficient in demanding circumstances is better preparation than institutional life that teaches primarily obedience." "He's right about that last part," Adelaide admitted grudgingly. "The orphanage system isn't exactly producing well-adjusted adults." She turned to the boys. "What do you want? If you could choose your future, what would it look like?" Samuel answered immediately. "We want to stay together. We want someone who sees us as people, not problems. Mr. Brennan has offered us that. We want to accept. All of you feel this way?" She addressed the question to the group, making eye contact with each boy individually. 5 voices overlapped in agreement. Even Peter, not fully understanding the legal complexities, nodded vigorously. Adelaide sighed, the sound carrying the weight of someone facing a decision with no perfect options. "Here's the reality. The Children's Aid Society has custody. They've arranged transfer to a Billings facility, Overriding that requires judicial approval, references, home inspection, and probably 3 months of bureaucratic process. I'm prepared to navigate that process, Jacob said, but in the meantime, these boys need somewhere to stay. The nearest temporary facility is in Helena, 2 days' travel. Sending them there while we process paperwork means they lose the stability you're claiming to offer. It also means there's no guarantee the judge will rule in your favor. They could end up in Helena indefinitely. She tapped her fingers against her notebook, thinking. There's an alternative. I could approve temporary emergency guardianship, good for 90 days, while we process the permanent petition. During that time, I'd conduct home visits, verify your circumstances, assess the children's well-being. If everything checks out, I'd support your permanent petition. If not, they'd be transferred to appropriate facilities. Hope surged through Samuel's chest, so intense it was almost painful. You'd let us stay with him? Provisionally, with conditions. Adelaide's voice became stern. Mr. Brennan, you'd need to bring these boys to town weekly for me to verify their well-being. You'd need to maintain detailed records of their education and development. Any sign of neglect, abuse, or failure to provide proper care, and they're removed immediately. Understood? Completely understood. You'll have full cooperation. And you boys, she addressed the children directly, you need to understand that if this arrangement doesn't work, if you're unhappy, unsafe, or not having your needs met, you can come to me and we'll make changes. Nobody's forcing you into anything. This is a trial period for everyone. Clear? Six heads nodded in solemn agreement. Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat. Adelaide, you're sure about this? Putting 6 children with a man who's been essentially a recluse for years. I'm not sure about anything, Tom, but I'm more concerned about sending them back into a system that's already failed them multiple times than I am about giving an unconventional solution a chance to work. She pulled forms from her leather case. Besides, sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, rather than the ones we're born into. As Adelaide began filling out paperwork with efficient precision, Samuel felt tears threatening. He forced them back, unwilling to appear weak or childish when everything hung in such delicate balance. But the relief was overwhelming. Not permanent security, but a chance. 3 months to prove that this impossible arrangement could work. Jacob placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, the touch brief but grounding. We'll make this work, he said quietly. I give you my word. And somehow, despite every lesson about trusting adults that Samuel had learned through bitter experience, he believed him. Outside, Timber Ridge continued its daily business, unaware that 7 lives had just been bound together through legal paperwork and desperate hope. The real test would come in the weeks ahead, in the daily work of becoming a family, in the moments of frustration and doubt, in the slow building of trust between people who'd been strangers just days ago. But for now, walking out of that office with temporary custody papers that kept 6 brothers together, it felt like victory. The first week at the cabin tested everyone's patience and revealed the vast gulf between wanting to be a family and actually functioning as one. Jacob had lived alone for so long that the constant noise, questions, and presence of 6 boys felt like an assault on his carefully ordered world. The boys, accustomed to institutional life with its rigid schedules and harsh discipline, struggled with the freedom and responsibility that came with Jacob's approach to child-rearing. The breaking point came on the 4th day. Samuel had been tasked with teaching the younger boys basic arithmetic, while Jacob worked on expanding the cabin's sleeping quarters. It should have been simple: addition and subtraction for the twins, number recognition for Peter. But Tommy and Marcus kept arguing over who got to use the slate first. Daniel wandered away to watch Jacob work instead of practicing his numbers. And Peter had somehow gotten into the flower stores and was creating elaborate patterns on the floor. Peter, no! Samuel lunged for his youngest brother, knocking over the water bucket in the process. The crash brought Jacob in from outside, saw in hand, to find the cabin in complete chaos, flour everywhere, water spreading across the floor, the twins wrestling instead of studying. and Samuel looking like he was about to cry from frustration. Jacob's jaw tightened. He set down the saw with deliberate care and surveyed the scene. "Everyone outside now!" The tone left no room for argument. 6 boys filed out into the cold afternoon air, ranging from Peter's confused tears to Samuel's mortified shame. Jacob followed, closing the door behind them. "Sit." He pointed to a fallen log that served as an informal bench. They sat, pressed together in a miserable row. Jacob paced for a moment, clearly working to control his temper. When he finally spoke, his voice was level but carried an edge they hadn't heard before. "I need to explain something to all of you. I spent 15 years alone because I told myself I couldn't handle the responsibility of caring for others after I failed my family. Taking you boys in was me trying to prove I could be better than the man I'd become. But I'm learning something important this week." He stopped pacing and faced them directly. "I don't know how to be a father to 6 children. I don't have instincts for this. I can teach you survival skills and academic subjects because those are things I know. But the daily management of a household with 6 personalities, 6 sets of needs, 6 different temperaments. I'm failing at that badly." Samuel's stomach dropped. Here it came, the admission that this had been a mistake, that they'd be going back to the system after all. But Jacob surprised him, which means we need to figure this out together. As a team, instead of me pretending I have all the answers. He sat down on the log beside them, his large frame somehow less intimidating when he was at their level. "Talk to me." "What's not working?" Silence. The boys exchanged uncertain glances, years of institutional life having taught them that admitting problems led to punishment. "I'm serious," Jacob pressed. "I need honest feedback. What's making this difficult for you?" Benjamin, who'd been quiet most of the week, finally spoke. "You don't tell us what you expect. In the orphanage, there were rules for everything. When to wake up, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. Here it's like you want us to know what to do without telling us." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's fair. I'm used to managing only myself. I make decisions as situations arise. But you need structure, predictability, and you don't explain things sometimes," Tommy added, emboldened by Benjamin's honesty. "This morning you told Marcus to stop doing something, but you didn't say why. So he didn't understand what he did wrong. I assumed the reason was obvious. But obvious to me isn't obvious to a 10-year-old. That's my failing." Jacob looked at Samuel. "What about you? You've been trying to hold everything together. What's not working?" Samuel hesitated, then decided honesty was worth the risk. "I don't know what my role is supposed to be. Am I supposed to be in charge of the others when you're busy? Am I just another kid? Am I supposed to help you like an adult would? Nobody's told me, so I've been trying to guess, and I keep guessing wrong. You're 14 years old. You're not an adult, and I shouldn't treat you like one. But you're also not the same as Peter. You need responsibility that matches your age." Jacob ran a hand through his beard, a gesture of frustration directed at himself. "I should have clarified that from the start." Daniel raised his hand tentatively, like he was in a schoolroom. "Mr. Brennan, are you going to send us back? Because of the mess and the fighting?" Jacob's expression softened. "No, Daniel. I'm not sending you back because of one chaotic afternoon. But we need to establish how this household functions, or we'll drive each other crazy." He stood and moved to face them again. "Here's what I propose. We create actual rules together. Not me dictating from on high, but all of us agreeing on what makes sense. Then everyone knows expectations, everyone has clarity. We get a say in the rules?" Marcus asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "You get a say. Not final authority. I'm still the adult, and some decisions aren't negotiable. But your input matters. You're the ones living this life too." For the next hour, they hammered out what would become the cabin's foundational structure. Jacob wrote everything down in a ledger he used for tracking furs, creating a document that was half contract, half family constitution. Wake-up would be at dawn, negotiable in winter when dawn came late. Breakfast would be communal, everyone eating together. Morning hours were for education, book learning, with Jacob teaching all 6 boys simultaneously rather than Samuel trying to manage it alone. Afternoon hours were for practical work, with age-appropriate tasks assigned to each boy. Evenings were flexible, time for personal projects, storytelling, or Jacob teaching specific skills. What about consequences? Samuel asked. When someone breaks a rule, what happens? It was a loaded question. Every boy at that table carried memories of punishments that far exceeded the offenses that triggered them. Jacob considered carefully before answering. Consequences should fit the infraction and should teach rather than just punish. If someone makes a mess, they clean it. If someone damages something through carelessness, they repair it or work to replace it. If someone endangers themselves or others through recklessness, we discuss why that's not acceptable and what could have happened. What about hitting? Peter asked quietly. When we're bad? Jacob knelt down to Peter's eye level. I told you before, and I'll say it again now so everyone hears it clearly. I will never hit any of you. Not with a hand, not with a belt, not with anything. If I'm angry, I'll tell you I'm angry. If you've done something dangerous or destructive, I'll tell you why it's unacceptable. But physical punishment is not how this family operates. He looked at each boy in turn. That doesn't mean there aren't boundaries or consequences. It means the consequences are meant to teach, not to hurt. And if I ever cross a line, if I'm too harsh or unfair, I expect you to tell Mrs. Preston during her visits. She's your protection against me if I fail to live up to this standard. The honesty of it was startling. Adults didn't usually admit they might fail, didn't usually give children permission to report them. Can we add something to the rules? Benjamin asked tentatively. Can we say that if someone's struggling with a task or assignment, they can ask for help without getting in trouble? Absolutely. In fact, asking for help when you need it should be encouraged, not punished. Jacob added it to the ledger. What else? They continued building their framework, practical rules about chores, educational expectations, safety protocols. But interwoven were agreements about respect, about communication, about how to handle conflicts before they escalated. By the time they finished, they had a document that none of them had seen before, a set of rules created with input from everyone who'd have to follow them. Designed not just to maintain order, but to help 7 people learn to live together. One more thing, Jacob said as they prepared to go back inside. Family meeting once a week. Everyone shares what's working and what's not. We adjust rules as needed. This isn't set in stone. It's a living document that grows as we learn what we need. That night, after the cabin had been cleaned and order restored, after dinner had been eaten and younger boys tucked into their newly constructed bunks, Samuel found Jacob outside staring at the stars. Thank you, Samuel said quietly, for not giving up on us today. Jacob glanced at him. Thank you for being honest about what wasn't working. That took courage. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Samuel asked the question that had been bothering him. Did you really think about sending us back? No, but I thought about failing you, which amounts to the same thing. Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. I told you before that I don't have instincts for this. That's true, but what I do have is stubbornness and a deep fear of becoming the kind of man who quits when things get difficult. So no, I won't send you back. But I need you and your brothers to help me learn how to do this right. We don't know how to do it either. We've never had a real family, then we're all learning together. That's terrifying, but also fair. The second week brought new challenges, but with their established framework, they navigated them more successfully. Jacob discovered that Tommy had a gift for mechanical understanding, able to look at complex tools and intuitively grasp how they functioned. Marcus, conversely, showed artistic talent, creating sketches of the cabin and surrounding wilderness that captured details Jacob's practical mind overlooked. Benjamin proved to be naturally organized, taking to the household management tasks with an efficiency that freed Jacob to focus on teaching and expanding their living space. Daniel had an uncanny ability with animals. The horses responded to him in ways they didn't with anyone else, and even wild creatures seemed less afraid when he approached. Peter, despite his age, showed surprising resilience and adaptability. He shadowed whoever would let him, absorbing information like a sponge. His questions endless but genuine, and Samuel revealed a hunger for learning that years of inadequate education had suppressed but not extinguished. He devoured the books in Jacob's collection, mathematics texts, natural science volumes, even poetry that Jacob had kept from his teaching days. In the evenings, Jacob would find Samuel reading by lamplight, his face intense with concentration. "You have a strong mind," Jacob told him one night. "With proper education, you could do anything. Go to university, become a teacher yourself, pursue whatever interests you most." Samuel looked up from the geology text he'd been studying. "The orphanage teachers always said I asked too many questions, that I should accept what I was told and stop trying to understand everything. Then they were fools. Questions are how we learn. Never apologize for wanting to understand the world." The weekly visits with Mrs. Preston became routine. She would arrive at the cabin, interview each boy separately to ensure they felt safe and cared for, inspect the living conditions, and review the educational progress Jacob documented meticulously. Her initial skepticism gradually transformed into cautious approval. "I'll admit, Mr. Brennan, I didn't think this would work," she said during her fourth visit. "But these boys are thriving. They've gained weight, their color is good, and more importantly, they're engaged and alert in ways institutionalized children rarely are." "They needed someone to believe in them," Jacob replied simply. "Someone to see potential instead of burden. You're giving them more than that. You're giving them purpose and competence. That's rarer than you might think, but not everyone in Timber Ridge shared Mrs. Preston's evolving opinion. The arrangement had become gossip fodder, dividing the community into those who admired Jacob's unconventional guardianship and those who viewed it as dangerous eccentricity. The conflict came to a head during the boys' first trip to town for church services, a requirement Mrs. Preston had added to ensure the boys had social interaction beyond the cabin. Jacob had resisted initially, his relationship with organized religion having died with his family. But he'd agreed when Samuel pointed out that the boys needed to be part of the broader community. The small Methodist church on Main Street was packed with the town's respectable citizens, all dressed in their Sunday finest. Jacob and the boys entered quietly, taking seats in the back row. The whispers started immediately, not quite loud enough to be openly rude, but certainly audible. Reverend Marcus Whitfield, a portly man in his 50s, with a voice that could rattle windows, chose that morning to preach about the sanctity of proper family structure. His sermon, ostensibly about biblical family values, made repeated references to children needing both mother and father, to the dangers of unconventional arrangements, to the importance of following societal norms established by scripture and tradition. Jacob's jaw tightened with each barely veiled reference, but he remained silent, unwilling to cause a scene in front of the boys. But when the sermon concluded and the congregation began filing out, several members made their opinions known more directly. Mr. Brennan, a sharp-faced woman named Constance Whitfield, the Reverend's wife, intercepted them on the church steps. "I must say I'm concerned about those poor children being raised in such irregular circumstances, without a mother's gentle influence, without proper Christian guidance. They're receiving education, care, and stability," Jacob replied evenly. "That seems fairly Christian to me. But surely you understand that children need feminine influences. A household of males living in isolation, learning heaven knows what sorts of rough habits." She trailed off meaningfully. Samuel felt anger rising but held his tongue, remembering Jacob's instruction to let him handle confrontations with adults. But Tommy, less controlled, spoke up. "Mr. Brennan teaches us reading and mathematics and how to survive. What more do we need?" Mrs. Whitfield looked at Tommy as if he were an interesting but inappropriate specimen. "Children should be seen and not heard, young man. Your speaking out of turn only proves my point about lack of proper upbringing. My upbringing is teaching me to speak truth respectfully," Tommy retorted. "Is that improper?" Before Mrs. Whitfield could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Constance, Perhaps you should focus on your own children's upbringing before critiquing others." The speaker was a woman in her late 30s, dressed practically rather than ostentatiously, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense bearing. She stepped forward and extended her hand to Jacob. "Margaret Hayes, I run the general store. I've been watching your supply purchases, and I have to say, Mr. Brennan, anyone who buys that many educational texts and that much quality food for growing boys has my approval. Regardless of what the gossips say." Jacob shook her hand, surprised by the support. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Miss Hayes, actually. Never saw the point in marrying." She smiled at the boys. "And I think what you're doing is admirable. These children look healthy, well-mannered, and genuinely happy. That's more than I can say for some properly conventional families in this town." The public endorsement from a respected business owner shifted the dynamic. Others who'd been watching uncertainly began to approach with curiosity rather than condemnation. A rancher asked Jacob about his teaching methods. A merchant's wife complimented the boy's neat appearance. Slowly, grudgingly, some of Timber Ridge began to accept that this strange arrangement might actually be working. But walking back to where they'd left the horses, Benjamin voiced the concern they all felt. "Will it always be like this? People judging us, questioning whether we deserve to be together." Jacob stopped and gathered them around him. "Probably. People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand how a family can exist outside traditional structures. But here's what matters. We know this is working. We know we're better together than we would be apart. And as long as we stay true to that, other people's opinions are just noise, even if they try to take us away." Daniel asked. "They won't. Mrs. Preston supports us, the law is on our side, and we're meeting every requirement they've set. But even if they tried, I'd fight them. All the way to the Territorial Supreme Court if necessary." His voice carried absolute conviction. "You boys are my family now. That's not just a legal arrangement, it's a choice I make every day. And I don't abandon family." Peter tugged on Jacob's coat. "Does that mean we're really, truly yours?" "Forever." Jacob knelt down, bringing himself to Peter's level. "It means you're really, truly mine, as long as you want to be. This isn't prison, it's home. But yes, little one, I'm in this for the long term. You're stuck with me." The smile that broke across Peter's face could have lit the entire territory. On the ride back to the cabin, Samuel reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. They'd gone from strangers trying to coexist to something that was beginning to resemble an actual family. They still had conflicts, still frustrated each other, still were learning each other's boundaries and needs. But beneath the daily challenges was a foundation being carefully built: trust, respect, and the growing realization that sometimes the best families were the ones forged by choice rather than blood. The cabin came into view as they crested the final ridge, smoke rising from the chimney like a welcome sign. It wasn't much, still crowded, still rough around the edges, still isolated from conventional society. But it was home, and that made all the difference. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains with the violent unpredictability that separated survivors from casualties. The snowmelt transformed placid streams into raging torrents. The warming days brought animals out of hibernation, some hungry and dangerous, and the changing weather patterns could shift from sunshine to deadly storm in less than an hour. Jacob had warned the boys about spring's deceptions, but warnings and experience were vastly different teachers. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in late March. During what had started as a routine educational expedition, Jacob had been taking the boys out regularly to teach practical wilderness skills: tracking, plant identification, understanding weather patterns by reading the sky and feeling the wind. These weren't recreational outings, but essential education for anyone living in the Bitterroot Range. The mountains showed no mercy to ignorance. Regardless of good intentions, that morning, Jacob had planned to teach them about identifying early spring edibles, plants that could supplement their diet and provide crucial nutrition after a long winter. They'd headed out at dawn, Jacob carrying his rifle as always. The boys equipped with collecting bags and notebooks for documenting what they learned. Samuel, Benjamin, and Tommy accompanied Jacob on the main expedition, venturing about 3 miles from the cabin to a meadow where glacier lilies and spring beauty typically emerged early. Marcus, Daniel, and Peter had stayed behind with specific assignments. Marcus to continue working on the detailed map he was creating of the surrounding area. Daniel to tend the horses and check the trapline. Peter to help with indoor chores under Marcus's supervision. The arrangement had become standard practice. The older boys rotated through advanced expeditions, while the younger ones handled age-appropriate responsibilities at the cabin. It developed independence while maintaining safety through the buddy system Jacob insisted upon. The meadow expedition went smoothly. Jacob showed them how to identify glacier lilies by their distinctive mottled leaves and yellow flowers, how to properly harvest spring beauty corms without damaging the plant's ability to regenerate, which early shoots were edible and which were toxic despite superficial similarities. Tommy proved particularly adept at identification, his mechanical mind translating easily to the systematic categorization of plant species. Benjamin took meticulous notes, creating a reference guide that could be consulted later. Samuel absorbed everything with the focused intensity he brought to all learning opportunities. They were preparing to return when Jacob froze mid-sentence. His head cocked slightly in a listening posture the boys had learned to recognize. Something had changed in the forest's ambient sound, a shift so subtle most people would miss it entirely, but which screamed warning to someone who'd spent 15 years reading wilderness signals. "What is it?" Samuel asked quietly, his hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife Jacob had recently given him. "Not sure." "Something's wrong." Jacob's eyes scanned the tree line with predatory focus. "Could be nothing. Could be a grizzly just out of hibernation and irritable. Either way, we head back now. Stay close, stay quiet, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments, no heroics. Understood?" 3 heads nodded in unison. They made their way back through the forest, with Jacob setting a pace that was quick without being panicked. The boys had learned to move quietly over the past months, understanding that noise in wilderness attracted attention, sometimes from things you very much didn't want to attract. They were within a mile of the cabin when they heard it, a distant scream that cut through the forest like a blade, young, terrified, and immediately recognizable. Peter. Jacob's carefully controlled demeanor shattered. He broke into a run, rifle unslung and ready, with Samuel, Benjamin, and Tommy struggling to keep pace behind him. The mile that separated them from the cabin felt infinite, each second stretching as terrible possibilities raced through Jacob's mind. They burst into the cabin clearing to find Marcus standing on the porch, white-faced and trembling, pointing toward the tree line on the eastern side. Peter went to check the trapline with Daniel. "We heard yelling." Daniel came running back, saying Peter fell into the ravine. "I was about to come find you." Jacob didn't wait for the rest. He was already moving toward the ravine, that deadly slash in the landscape, about a quarter mile from the cabin, where spring runoff created a churning, ice-cold torrent 40 feet below. The boys had been explicitly forbidden from going near it without adult supervision. Daniel met them halfway, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry. I told him not to go close, but he saw something in the water and leaned over to look, and the edge gave way and he fell, and I couldn't reach him, and—" "Where?" Jacob's voice was sharp with controlled fear. "Exactly where?" Daniel led them to the spot, a section where winter erosion had weakened the bank, leaving an overhang that looked solid but wasn't. Fresh, disturbed earth marked where Peter had gone over. Jacob dropped to his belly and crawled to the edge. Looking down into the ravine, Peter clung to a protruding root about 15 feet down, his small body pressed against the muddy slope, the roaring water just feet below him. His face was sheet-white, his hands locked around the root with the desperate strength of pure terror. As Jacob watched, a chunk of earth near Peter's left foot broke away and tumbled into the torrent below. "Peter!" Jacob called, fighting to keep his voice calm. "Don't move! Stay exactly where you are. I'm coming to get you. I'm scared." Peter's voice was barely audible over the water's roar. "Jacob, I'm scared!" It was the first time Peter had called him by name rather than Mr. Brennan, and the intimacy of it in this moment of crisis hit Jacob like a physical blow. This wasn't just a child in his care, this was his child. The boy who'd called him by name because in terror he'd reached for the closest thing to a father he had. "I know you're scared, but you're doing great. Just hold on tight. I'll be there in less than a minute." Jacob pulled back from the edge and rapidly assessed options. The slope was too unstable for a direct descent. His weight would likely trigger a larger collapse. But about 30 yards downstream, the ravine widened and the slope became more gradual. If he could reach that point, he could work his way back along the water's edge. "Samuel!" Jacob's voice was all business now, commander rather than father. "Take the rope from my pack. Secure it to that pine tree. 3 wraps, proper knots like I taught you. Benjamin, your anchor. Tommy, you stay with Marcus and Daniel. Keep them calm." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and handed Samuel his rifle. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes with Peter, you leave the rope secured and go to town for help. Don't try to come after us. That's an order." "Promise me?" "Jacob, promise me, Samuel." Samuel's face was stricken, but he nodded. "I promise." Jacob tied the rope around his waist and moved to the ravine's edge at the wider point. The descent was treacherous, mud and loose rock shifting under every step, but he used saplings and exposed roots as handholds, working his way down with careful speed. The water was brutally cold when he reached the bottom, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. Even with his experience, he felt the cold's immediate bite, the way it wanted to steal strength and coordination. He worked his way along the ravine's edge, staying just above the waterline, using rocks and roots to maintain position against the current's pull. Peter was 15 feet ahead now, still clinging to his route, his small body shaking. Whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, Jacob couldn't tell. "Peter, I'm almost there. Just a little longer." The route Peter clung to chose that moment to shift slightly, settling deeper into the loosening earth with a sound that was felt more than heard. Peter whimpered, his grip tightening impossibly further. Jacob covered the last distance in a controlled scramble, positioning himself directly below Peter. The boy was too high for Jacob to reach from his current position. But if he could get Peter to trust him enough to let go. "Peter, listen to me carefully. I'm right below you. I need you to let go of the root and drop." "I'll catch you. I promise I'll catch you." "I can't." Peter's voice was ragged with terror. "I'll fall in the water." "You won't. I'm here. I won't let you fall. But that root is coming loose. If you wait much longer, it'll give way, and you'll have no control over when you fall. Right now you have a choice. Let go on purpose, and I'll catch you." It was asking the impossible, for a 4-year-old to overcome every survival instinct and deliberately let go of the only thing keeping him from disaster. But Peter had learned over the past months that Jacob meant what he said, that his promises could be trusted. "You promise you'll catch me?" "I promise. On everything I am, I promise." Peter closed his eyes, took a shuddering breath and let go. The drop lasted less than a second but felt eternal. Jacob's hands closed around Peter's small body, pulling him in tight against his chest. The impact drove Jacob back against the slope, muddy water surging over their legs, but he kept his footing, kept his grip, kept his promise. Peter's arms locked around Jacob's neck with strangling force, his whole body shaking with sobs of relief and residual terror. Jacob held him, one arm supporting the boy, the other hand finding purchase on the slope to begin the climb back up. The ascent was harder than the descent had been. Jacob's muscles burned, his fingers were going numb from cold, and Peter's added weight made every movement a calculated risk. But the rope Samuel had secured provided crucial support. An inch by hard-won inch, Jacob worked his way back up the ravine's unstable slope. Samuel's face appeared at the edge, pale but determined. "I've got the rope. Benjamin's anchoring. We'll pull when you're ready." "On 3, Jacob called up. 1, 2, 3. The boys hauled on the rope with strength born of desperation, while Jacob pushed from below. Driving with his legs, pulling with his free hand, Peter clutched against his chest like the precious cargo he was. The final scramble over the edge left them all sprawling in the mud, breathing hard, but safe. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jacob sat up, still holding Peter, and pulled all 5 other boys into an embrace that was fierce and desperate, and spoke of how close they'd come to tragedy. "Is everyone all right?" Jacob asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Choruses of yes and nodding heads. Jacob looked at Daniel, saw the guilt written across the boy's face, and spoke before the guilt could solidify into something permanent. "Daniel, what happened wasn't your fault. Peter made a choice that had consequences. You did exactly right by coming for help immediately, instead of trying to solve it yourself. But I was supposed to watch him. You're 9 years old. The responsibility for safety is mine, not yours. Peter knows he shouldn't have gone close to the edge. That was his choice. Your only job was to get help, and you did that perfectly." Jacob turned his attention to Peter, who was still clinging to him but had stopped crying. "Peter, look at me." The small boy raised his tear-streaked face. "You broke a rule. A serious rule that exists because breaking it can get you killed. Do you understand that?" Peter nodded miserably. "What's the consequence we agreed on for breaking safety rules?" Peter's voice was tiny. "I have to explain why the rule exists and what I should have done differently." "That's right. And you'll do that tonight at family meeting. But right now, I need you to understand something more important than consequences." Jacob's voice gentled. "When you called for me down there, when you trusted me enough to let go, that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen anyone do. You were terrified, but you trusted anyway. That's what family means. Knowing that when you're in trouble, when you're scared, when you need help, the people who love you will be there." He pulled Peter close again. "I will always be there for you. For all of you. That's not conditional on good behavior or perfect choices. It's just true. You're mine, and I take care of what's mine." Samuel felt tears on his own face, and he wasn't ashamed of them. Neither, he noticed, was Benjamin. Even Tommy's eyes were suspiciously bright. They returned to the cabin as a unit, muddy and exhausted, but bound together by something that couldn't be adequately named. The crisis had tested them, tested their training, their trust in each other, in their ability to function as a family unit under pressure, and they'd passed. That evening's family meeting was unlike any they'd held before. Peter explained through hiccuping tears why approaching unstable edges was dangerous, what he should have done differently, and what signs to watch for that indicated unsafe ground. But the discussion expanded beyond just Peter's mistake. Jacob talked about the fear he'd felt seeing Peter in danger, the way it had clarified exactly how much these 6 boys had come to mean to him. Samuel admitted how helpless he'd felt watching from above, unable to do anything but hold a rope and trust that Jacob would succeed. Daniel confessed his guilt about not preventing the accident, and the relief he felt when Jacob had absolved him of responsibility. They talked about trust, about fear, about the difference between being careful and being paralyzed by worry. They revised some safety protocols and reinforced others. And when it was done, when everything that needed saying had been said, they sat together around the fire in comfortable silence. "We're getting better at this," Benjamin observed quietly. "Being a family, I mean." "We are," Jacob agreed. "Not perfect. We'll never be perfect, but better. And that's enough." Outside, spring continued its volatile transformation of the landscape. Inside, 7 people who'd been thrown together by desperation and legal documents sat in a circle and understood that somewhere along the way, they'd stopped being an arrangement and become something real. Mrs. Preston's next visit found them all still processing the near tragedy. Jacob reported the incident honestly, knowing that withholding it would be grounds for losing custody. He expected censure, possibly a re-evaluation of the guardianship. Instead, Adelaide Preston listened to the full account, Jacob's version, the boys' versions, the lessons learned and protocols revised, and then surprised them all. "Mr. Brennan, in the past 3 months I've visited dozens of families. Some traditional, some not. And I've learned that perfect safety is an illusion. Children get hurt, make mistakes, face dangers. What matters is how families respond to crisis. She looked around at the 7 faces watching her. You responded exactly right. Training was applied, trust was demonstrated, and everyone learned from the experience. That's not failure, that's exactly what family does. She updated her records, noted the revised safety protocols, and before leaving, pulled Jacob aside. The 90-day temporary custody period ends next week. I'm recommending permanent guardianship. The judge will have final say, but based on everything I've observed, you've proven that unconventional doesn't mean dysfunctional. These boys are thriving. That's all that matters. After she left, Jacob gathered the boys and delivered the news. The explosion of relieved joy, 6 boys talking over each other, laughing, some crying, all pressing close, was everything he'd never known he needed. Does this mean we're really yours? Peter asked for what felt like the 100th time, still needing reassurance. This means, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide, that we're really each other's, all of us, for as long as we choose to be. And I choose forever. It was a promise spoken in a cabin in the Montana wilderness, witnessed by mountains that had seen countless human dramas play out across centuries. Most of those stories had been forgotten, erased by time and weather, and the simple fact that few lives leave permanent marks on such an ancient landscape. But this story of 6 orphaned boys and 1 broken man who found each other in desperation and built something that looked like redemption would echo through generations. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to give up on each other, and sometimes the strongest families are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared crisis. When everyone involved learns that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice made repeatedly, especially when things are hard. 2 years transformed the cabin from a solitary outpost into something resembling a small compound. The original structure had been expanded with a bunkhouse that gave the older boys their own space, while keeping them close enough to maintain family connection. A proper schoolroom addition housed the growing library Jacob continued to accumulate, along with scientific equipment he'd somehow acquired through his trading networks, microscopes, surveying tools, even a small telescope that turned winter evenings into astronomy lessons. The boys had grown in ways that went beyond simple physical development, though that was evident too. Samuel, now 16, stood nearly as tall as Jacob, his frame filling out with the lean muscle that came from mountain living. Benjamin had become Jacob's right hand in managing the household, his organizational mind creating systems that kept 7 people functioning efficiently in wilderness isolation. The twins, Tommy and Marcus, had developed into complementary specialists, Tommy's mechanical aptitude leading him to apprentice occasionally with the blacksmith in Timber Ridge, while Marcus's artistic talents had evolved into genuine cartography skills. His maps of the Bitterroot Range were now sought after by trappers and surveyors, providing unexpected income for the family. Daniel, at 11, had become the unofficial veterinarian for the area, his natural rapport with animals expanding into actual medical knowledge as Jacob taught him anatomy and common treatments. Ranchers who'd once questioned Jacob's guardianship now sought Daniel's help with difficult horses or ailing livestock. And Peter, now 6 years old and starting to lose his baby features, had become the heart of their makeshift family, the one who could make Jacob laugh when stubbornness had set in, who could diffuse tensions between brothers with his innocent observations, who reminded them all what they were building and why it mattered. The legal guardianship had been made permanent 18 months earlier in a hearing that had drawn surprising community support. Miss Margaret Hayes had testified about the boys' positive impact on Timber Ridge. Dr. William Foster, the town physician who'd treated various minor injuries and illnesses over the months, spoke about the excellent care Jacob provided. Even Sheriff Garrett, initially skeptical, had endorsed the arrangement, but the most powerful testimony came from the boys themselves. The judge, A stern woman named Helena Blackwood, who'd presided over territorial family cases for 2 decades, had interviewed each boy privately. Whatever they'd told her had been enough to make her decision swift and unequivocal. "Mr. Brennan," she'd said from the bench, her voice carrying through the small courtroom, "I've reviewed hundreds of custody cases. I've seen every variation of family structure imaginable, and I've learned that what makes a family isn't biology or tradition. It's commitment, care, and the daily choice to show up for each other." She'd looked at the 6 boys sitting in the front row, then back at Jacob. "These children are thriving in your care. They're educated, healthy, emotionally secure, and demonstrably happy. You've created something unconventional, but undeniably successful. Permanent guardianship is granted. May you all continue to flourish together." The celebration that night at the cabin had been raucous and joy-filled, all 7 of them understanding that they'd cleared the final legal hurdle, that no one could separate them now short of genuine harm or neglect. But the true test of what they'd built came not from legal challenges or community skepticism. It came from within, from the tensions that naturally arise when people grow and change and begin to envision futures that might diverge from the present. Samuel brought the conflict to a head on a summer evening in August, 2 years and 4 months after that frozen day on the railway platform. They'd finished dinner and were gathered on the expanded porch Jacob had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. "I've been accepted," Samuel said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence, "to the Territorial University in Helena, full scholarship based on the entrance examinations." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of implications spreading outward. Jacob set down the piece of wood he'd been carving, his expression unreadable. The other boys looked between Samuel and Jacob, sensing the weight of this announcement. "When did you apply?" Jacob asked, his voice carefully neutral. 3 months ago. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to cause conflict if nothing came of it. But they accepted me. I'd start in September." Samuel met Jacob's eyes directly. "I want to go. But I need to know you understand. It's not about leaving you or the family. It's about becoming more so I can eventually contribute more." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face revealing the internal struggle. They'd built this family, carved it out of mutual need and deliberate choice. The thought of it fragmenting, of Samuel leaving, touched old wounds Jacob had thought healed. But healing meant accepting that love sometimes required letting go. "Of course you should go," Jacob said finally, and his voice held only pride with no trace of recrimination. "You have a remarkable mind, Samuel. Keeping you here when you could be developing it further would be selfish. The whole point of family is raising children to be independent, not keeping them dependent. You're not angry." "I'm terrified," Jacob admitted with brutal honesty. "Terrified you'll go to Helena and realize how limited this life has been, how much bigger the world is than these mountains. Terrified you'll find opportunities that take you even further away. Terrified that the family we've built will dissolve as you boys grow into men with your own paths." He stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the wilderness that had been his refuge and his prison before it became his home. "But that terror is my problem, not yours. You're 16 years old with your whole life ahead of you. If I've done my job right, I've prepared you to chase whatever future calls to you, not to feel obligated to stay in mine." Benjamin spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Sam leaving doesn't mean the family dissolves. It means the family grows to accommodate new shapes. He'll come back during breaks. He'll write letters. He'll stay connected even when he's not physically here." "Exactly," Samuel said, relief evident that Benjamin understood. "And who knows? Maybe what I learn in Helena will help us build something even better here. Maybe I can bring knowledge back that serves everyone." Tommy grinned. "Maybe you'll become some fancy professor and make us all look good by association. Or maybe I'll fail spectacularly and come running back here with my tail between my legs, begging you all to forget I ever had ambitions. Then we'll welcome you back and only mock you moderately. Marcus deadpanned, earning laughs that cut through the tension. Peter, who'd been quiet throughout, suddenly scrambled into Jacob's lap, despite being really too big for such gestures. Samuel going to school doesn't mean he stops being our brother, right? Right, Jacob confirmed, wrapping arms around the boy. Family isn't about physical proximity. It's about the bonds we choose to maintain, regardless of distance. The conversation opened floodgates. Daniel admitted he'd been thinking about apprenticing full-time with Dr. Foster, learning formal veterinary medicine beyond what Jacob could teach. Marcus had been commissioned to create a comprehensive map series for the Territorial Surveying Office, work that would require spending weeks at a time in the field. Each revelation could have felt like abandonment, like the slow dissolution of everything they'd built. Instead, with Jacob's blessing and encouragement, it felt like evolution, the natural growth of individuals within a family structure strong enough to bend without breaking. "I have a confession too," Jacob said, after the boys had shared their various ambitions and plans. "I've been corresponding with the Territorial Education Board. They've asked me to develop a curriculum for frontier education, combining traditional academics with practical wilderness skills, the way we do here. It would mean traveling to other remote communities, training teachers, maybe spending weeks away at a time." Samuel felt a surge of pride mixed with irony. So the man who spent 15 years avoiding humanity is now volunteering to work with multiple communities. Funny how life changes you when you let it. Jacob's expression softened. "You boys did that. You reminded me that isolation isn't strength. It's just fear wearing a different name. If I can help other communities educate their children better, help other families understand that learning happens in multiple forms, then maybe what we've built here can matter beyond just the 7 of us. It already matters beyond us," Benjamin said quietly. "Half the families in Timber Ridge have changed how they approach their children's education because of watching us. Margaret Hayes told me she's had parents asking for book lists, wanting to know how we balance practical and academic learning. Which brings me to something I've been considering," Jacob continued, the words coming slowly, as if he was still formulating the thought even as he spoke it. "This place, this approach to family and education, what if it could serve more than just us?" He gestured to the compound they'd built, the expanded structures and systems that had evolved to accommodate 6 growing boys. "There are other children out there like you were, orphaned, abandoned, slipping through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. What if we formalized this, became an actual placement option for children who need unconventional solutions? You want to take in more kids?" Tommy asked, surprise evident. "I'm suggesting we consider it. Not immediately. You boys deserve to have your family stable and secure. But in the future, once you're older and more independent, once our systems are even better established, maybe." The idea settled over them, revolutionary in its implications. What had started as desperation, a lonely man saving 6 freezing boys, could become something institutional, something that offered other children the same chance they'd been given. "We'd need to build more structures," Benjamin said, his organizational mind already working through logistics. "Develop more formal procedures, probably bring in additional adults to help manage. We'd need legal recognition as an actual placement facility," Samuel added, "which means regulation, oversight, documentation, but we'd be offering something no orphanage can," Daniel observed. "Real family structure, individualized attention, education that prepares kids for actual life, not just institutional compliance." Marcus was already sketching on a piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket. "We could expand the compound here, build dormitories in clusters to maintain small, family-like groups. Keep the educational buildings centralized, but give each group their own space." Jacob watched them. These 6 boys who'd been strangers barely 2.5 years ago, now planning futures, both individual and collective, with the easy collaboration of people who truly trusted each other. "It's just an idea," he said. "Nothing we need to decide tonight or even this year. But I wanted you to know I've been thinking about legacy, about what happens to this place. This approach, this family we've built after I'm gone. "You're not that old," Peter protested, alarmed. "I'm 43, which means I've hopefully got plenty of years left. But eventually you boys will inherit this land, this compound, the systems we've created. I want you to have options for what to do with it, beyond just selling it off or abandoning it." Samuel stood and walked to stand beside Jacob at the railing. "Whatever we decide about the future, whatever paths we individually take, this place will always be home. Because home isn't about buildings or land, it's about the people who made you feel like you belonged." He looked at his brothers, seeing in their faces the same understanding. "Before we came here, we were 6 separate people trying desperately to stay connected because we had nothing else. You gave us something else, a foundation, secure enough that we can grow individually without losing our collective identity." "That's what good families do," Jacob said simply. "They provide roots strong enough to support growth in multiple directions." As darkness fell over the Bitterroot Range, the 7 of them remained on the porch, talking about futures both near and distant. Samuel would leave for Helena in September, but he'd return for holidays and summers. Daniel would split time between the cabin and town during his apprenticeship. Marcus's mapping work would take him away periodically, but always lead back home. And someday, maybe, the compound would expand to welcome other children who needed what these 6 had found: safety, education, belonging, and the revolutionary idea that family could be chosen rather than merely endured. 10 years later, the Brennan Family Academy stood as a recognized institution within the Montana Territory. The original cabin remained at the compound's heart, preserved deliberately as a reminder of humble origins. Around it, carefully planned structures housed up to 30 children at any given time, clustered in small, family-like groups, each with dedicated adult mentors trained in Jacob's educational philosophy. Samuel, now a 26-year-old professor of natural sciences at the Territorial University, served on the Academy's board while maintaining his academic career. Benjamin managed the Academy's daily operations with the same organizational brilliance he'd brought to managing a household of 7. Daniel ran the Academy's animal husbandry program when he wasn't, tending to his growing veterinary practice. Tommy had become a renowned craftsman whose mechanical innovations improved life throughout the territory. Marcus's cartography business thrived, though he still donated time teaching geography and art to Academy students. And Peter, now 16 himself and preparing for his own university admission, worked as a mentor to the youngest children, offering them the same patience and gentleness he'd received. Jacob, now 53 with more grey in his beard than brown, moved through the expanded compound with the satisfaction of someone who'd found purpose beyond survival. The man who'd once fled humanity to avoid pain had become the cornerstone of a community dedicated to proving that broken people could heal, that unconventional families could thrive, and that children written off by society could flourish when given proper support and genuine love. On a spring morning that echoed that frozen day a decade earlier, Jacob stood on the railway platform in Timber Ridge, the same platform where 6 boys had nearly frozen to death. But this time he wasn't saving children from neglect. He was welcoming them through a formal partnership with the Children's Aid Society, which now viewed the Academy as a premier placement option. 3 children stepped off the train, siblings, orphaned by circumstances that were tragic but depressingly common. They looked at Jacob with the same wariness Samuel had shown a decade ago, the same distrust born from disappointment repeated too many times. "I'm Jacob Brennan," he said, crouching to their level. "I run a school up in the mountains. It's not like other places you've been. We do things differently there. We believe children deserve more than just survival. They deserve to thrive. We believe family is something you build, not something you're born into. And we believe that every child deserves someone who'll fight for them." The oldest, a girl of about 13, studied him with eyes that had seen too much. "What's the catch?" Jacob smiled, hearing echoes of Samuel in that question. The catch is, you have to work hard, be honest, and commit to being part of something bigger than just yourself. In exchange, you get education, safety, and a family that won't give up on you even when things are difficult. Sound fair? 3 children looked at each other, communicating in the silent language of siblings who'd learned to rely only on each other. Then tentatively the girl nodded. Good, let's go home, as Jacob led them to the wagon where Peter waited to help with the journey to the compound. He thought about that desperate morning a decade ago when he'd seen 6 boys freezing and made the choice to intervene. That single decision had transformed not just 7 lives, but dozens, all the children who'd since passed through the academy, all the families who'd learned different ways of being from their example, all the communities that had adopted their educational approaches. The story that had begun with chains and an auction block, with freezing children and a broken man, had evolved into something neither could have imagined, a legacy of proving that love could be chosen, that families could be forged, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply refusing to walk past suffering when you had the power to intervene. No child gets left behind. It had started as a desperate promise made to 6 orphaned boys on a frozen platform. It had become a philosophy, an institution, and ultimately a testament to the revolutionary idea that every child deserves someone who'll show up, fight for them, and prove through daily choices that they matter. As the wagon rolled away from Timber Ridge toward the mountains, carrying 3 more children toward uncertain futures that held at least the possibility of hope, Jacob Brennan understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending pain never happened. It was about transforming that pain into purpose, about ensuring that your suffering and your survival meant something beyond just your own life. He'd lost a daughter named Emma 15 years ago and thought his capacity for fatherhood had died with her. Instead, he'd learned that fatherhood could expand to encompass dozens, that the love he'd thought finite was actually inexhaustible when properly directed. The mountains rose ahead, ancient and indifferent to human drama. But nestled in those mountains was a compound where broken children learned to be whole, where unconventional families thrived, and where one man's choice to intervene had rippled outward into something that looked remarkably like redemption. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and growing and built on the foundational truth that sometimes the most powerful way to heal yourself is to help heal others. The wagon disappeared into the tree line, carrying 3 more children toward home. Behind them, the railway platform stood empty once again, waiting for the next train, the next arrival, the next opportunity for someone to choose compassion over convenience. And in the mountains, 7 people who'd been strangers once upon a frozen morning continued building a legacy that would outlast them all. Proof that family, in its truest form, isn't about blood or law or tradition. It's about the daily choice to show up for each other, to fight for each other, and to prove through action that no child gets left behind when someone cares enough to intervene. That was the story of Jacob Brennan and 6 brothers who became his sons. And it was just the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.